Hi, I'm Rick Mahaffey. I've been teaching here at TCC since 1991. I made my first pot about 1956. So I guess I'm here to talk about the exhibition, my work in the exhibition and culture. Culture is a learned thing. And I also think some of it is inherited, but you might have an affinity for certain things because of your background or exposure. So in the show I have tea bowls, particularly Japanese tea bowls. So it's a very small part of ceramics. So maybe the way I got there, none of my grandparents were born in the United States. One in the Philippines, one in the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa, one in Agua Caliente in Mexico, and one in the Indian Territory. The grandfather from the Philippines I never knew. He died when my mother was 5, so I never knew him, but the other three I did. The one who was born in Indian Territory, west of the United States, during the time of the Exclusion Act, where Asians and particularly Chinese were excluded from entering the United States legally, he was helping them get in the United States to be with their families from Mexico. He got arrested and thrown in jail. They took away his citizenship, which theoretically he never had in the first place. And then one of the presidents, I forget which one, I saw the letter, reinstated his citizenship. So I got a mixed background, and that's not, if you go a little farther out in my family, one of my great aunt, full-blooded Paiute Indian, and she adopted a young girl from Alaska who was half Tlingit and half Inuit. So we had all these mixed in the family, and there's more, but so anyway, there's lots of different cultures and things going on that I grew up with. And for me, one of the best ways to get into a culture to understand it is through the food. People that know me well know that I like food from a lot of different cultures. So these tea bowls, tea came from China to Japan maybe 1,300 years ago. And Japan had been closed and opened several times. And times when they were open, the country was open, they brought in Chinese culture. They adopted Chinese writing wholesale. And in Japanese, each character has 2 readings, one in Japanese and one that's the old Chinese, sort of. So they adopted tea and Chan, or Zen Buddhism as it's called in Japanese, about the same time. Zen Buddhism came a little bit later, and they adopted Chinese tea ceremonies. And Chinese tea utensils. And the Chinese utensils are more perfect in shape and more uniform. And then in the 1500s, a tea master named Sen no Rikyu followed another tea master who's a little more obscure for us Westerners. And they started to alter tea, and Sen no Rikyu really kind of solidified what we call wabi tea. So the wabi-sabi aesthetic, which had a huge influence on Japanese art and all Japanese culture, is finding beauty in the imperfect. With things that are what we would call perfect, you look at one side and turn it, look at another side, it's the same. So it's really one piece. Whereas something that's not perfectly even, if you look at one side and then turn it, it can change and be different. And that's one thing I like. The machine-like is not necessarily my forte. I can kind of force myself to do it, but I'm not happy there. So I enjoy the conversation with the clay, seeing what it's doing that day, and then reacting to that, and maybe making a whole series of pieces and let the conversation flow. So one idea will evolve through several. There was an idea in here and it just got away. So part of the tea is the concept of ichigo ichie, where even with the same people and the same utensils, it's a new experience with that. So if we used a tea bowl and made tea in it and used it, had a tea ceremony, and then 6 months or a year later came back and did another one with the same bowl and the same utensils, the people have changed because they've experienced things through time, and the bowl has been changed because it was used. Part of the Japanese understanding of the impermanence of things and life, it's one of the reasons they really like to look at the cherry blossoms. They're beautiful, and it gives them an excuse to sit under the trees and eat special food and drinks the new sake and have their friends' conversation. But then the petals fall. They're not sad, but it's an acknowledgement that life is impermanent and it's short, among other things. So with these bowls, in addition to working the conversation when I make them on the wheel and then turning over and trimming them, that's another opportunity for things to change. And then when they're glazed, depending on how they're glazed, if they're glazed in an electric kiln, I have a really good idea how they're going to come out. If they're in a kiln fired with gas, then a little less certain, but pretty certain. And then like these two fired in a wood-fired kiln, there's a lot that goes on with different kind of wood going in, firing for several days, so more people involved, and how they react to the kiln, what the weather's like, how wet the wood is, all those things get involved. So it's a lot more of a surprise when you open the wood kiln. The other thing, a Japanese potter who came to the United States several times in the 1950s and early 1960s and did workshops, named Hamada Shoji. He was a living national treasure. He said, a really good tea bowl is like holding a small universe in your hand. And so maybe someday I'll get part of a planet in one of these tea bowls. I don't aspire to get a universe in my hand, but hopefully there's something there that's more than just on the surface. So I traveled to Japan a bunch of time and lived there for 7 months as a visiting foreign researcher, and worked in a studio of a friend who was a really good potter. And that's when I started to think about making tea bowls. I was pretty young at that time. I was 46. That's awful young to be making tea bowls. Didn't have enough experience. Certainly not enough in the Japanese way of doing things. But Wasa and I talked as well as we could. His English was limited, and my Japanese was even more limited. But we managed, and that kind of got me started toward making tea bowls. I didn't make any for a couple years, and then decided to start working on it. And then participated in several tea ceremonies, and that helps to know how they're used. So I don't know what else to say. Yeah, a question?
So if you get a chip on one of your tea bowls, do you repair it or do you let it be part of the sabi?
So, like in use, or maybe from the firing, or anyway?
Any way, because I understand like part of the repair, that becomes part of the piece, but
Yeah.
it's not always repaired. Sometimes the chip is allowed to
Yeah.
be part of that history.
Yeah, that kintsugi. Kin is gold, and I forget what sugiru is, but in Japan they use lacquer and gold leaf to repair it. And so, like this one would be really pretty if it was broken and repaired with a gold line or two in it. So if the pot is good enough, I will repair it. But I don't have access to the lacquer, and I can't afford the gold leaf. So, and don't tell anybody this, but I use epoxy with bronze powder in it. And it looks, and you can get different kinds of bronze powder. It looks a lot like the gold. And the epoxy provides the strength. It just, when you add something to the epoxy, it takes a lot longer to set. So in that sense, it's a lot more like the lacquer. So those bowls that have been damaged and repaired, oftentimes are more revered, and that's part of that Ichigo Ichie, changing the experience. The bowl has a life of its own in a sense. So that can add to it. So when you look at a bowl, a tea bowl, maybe this one's better. So the lip, where it's wavy like this, you think of it as mountains, and then this surface is landscape. And so when you serve tea from a tea ceremony, you drink the tea, and then you look at the bowl, and then carefully, depending on how much residue is in here, turn it over and look at the way it's trimmed. And one of the things about the tea ceremony that I really like, and it's one of the things I think that appealed to the aristocracy and the samurai class, was you had to be present 100%, be there in the moment. So with a wabi tea house, the door is often low, and everyone, even the emperor, had to stoop to come in. And once you're inside, other than being the primary guest and secondary guests, everyone's equal. So during tea ceremony, people can do difficult negotiations or talk about difficult subjects. The reason tea bowls in Japan are expensive is the closer to the tea, the more expensive the piece is. So the bowl is pretty close because we make tea in it. But the tea caddy, or chaire, is the most expensive piece because it holds the tea. And typically they would have often an ivory lid, and then there's gold leaf inside to protect the tea. And then for potters, Japan is a pretty amazing place because there's a large part of the public that's educated about ceramics. As an example, there's primarily a group of potters, but there was some painters and sculptors in there at this party. And one of the things they did was take different pots and turn them upside down. So you're looking at this part. And the idea was to identify the clay. Where did the clay come from each piece? And they have a term for the clay where you can see it. It's called Tsuchi Aji. And you might recognize Aji from Ajinomoto or MSG. And Aji is flavor. So it's the clay flavor. And so that's real important. It'd be like, I guess for a printmaker, the paper is really important. And so they choose a paper to get a certain effect. And so if you really look at a print, you have to look, besides looking at the ink, you need to look at the paper. And it's the same thing with the pot. And that's one of the things that intrigues me about tea bowls, besides the fact that it's a narrow area in size and so forth. The fact that there are boundaries that you have to meet requires that you be more creative. So, yeah, anyway, got a long ways from culture. Any other questions?
How would I identify a tea bowl as opposed to, say, just a pot or a bowl itself? Or is it a certain standard or certain?
It depends who's holding it. So it should fit your hand. And the diameter of the foot should feel comfortable in your hand. So you need to be able to pick it up this way. So you need to be able to use the whisk in it to whip the tea. So you do kind of a W or an M shape, and they froth it up quite a bit, and then set it down, and so this would be the front. So I'd make the tea with the front facing me, turn it, and then set it out and invite the guest to take it. And they would take it with the front toward them. And depending on the tea school, turn it a quarter or half a revolution and drink from there. And usually 3 sips. And so it can't be too big, can't be too heavy. And like I say, you have to be able to pick it up. This one is a little problematic because the foot isn't tall enough. So maybe you can pick it up here. And it's a little heavy, so this would be a good one for a woman to use, perhaps, with smaller hands. But then it's kind of heavy, so maybe it isn't so good for that. So what else about it? And in tea bowls, almost anything can be a tea bowl. So it could be a bowl from your set of china, as long as the shape's about right. And more recently, there's groups that are avant-garde tea schools, and they use all kinds of things. They'll use all kinds of interesting things for utensils. So you have a kettle that you heat the water in, and a scoop to get the water out to put in the tea bowl. You have a cold water jar, and then a kind of a wastewater jar, so that when you clean the bowl, that water goes into this other one. It can be like a large bowl. And the cold water jar take some water out and pour it into the tea kettle. It doesn't have a spout like we think of. And the sound of that water is part of the tea ceremony. And hearing the boiling is part, I'm told. I've never heard it because of my hearing impairment.
So you mentioned the avant-garde tea houses. What are the kinds of changes that have occurred in, you know, from traditional tea houses compared to avant-garde? I mean, what are the differences that there might be?
Difference between
I mean,
what's a tea house like?
No, avant-garde, you mentioned avant-garde tea.
Oh, okay. So in avant-garde tea, they might put up a couple walls in here and build a floor with the tatami mats and do the tea ceremony in here. So I've seen tea ceremonies in the Senate room here. In the avant-garde tea, I haven't been to one of those ceremonies, but I've seen the demonstrations of it. Mostly what we see are the utensils they use. And I have, the demonstrations would be like in a space like this, where they might do 2 walls and a floor. And they're a lot freer. If you follow one of the tea schools, Senno Rikyu committed seppuku, or ritual suicide, and he had sons, and each son started a different school. There's Ura Senkei, which is the school behind, and Imoto Senkei, and another school. And there's a couple of them have location names, like behind or off to the left, and each one does it a little differently. So, and they're more traditional, but the avant-garde has a lot more freedom. But then the freedom requires that you be more well-versed, I think, in the basis of the tea ceremony and the theories. So, yeah. So, any other questions?
The container for the tea, is there a particular shape that those containers usually are?
The tea caddy? They're usually a real small opening. You're going to get the tea out with this scoop. So, you know, an opening, a small opening, and the small opening helps keep the tea fresher rather than a large opening, less exposes a lot of it to air.
So it'd be more like a bottle shape?
Yeah, it's like this often.
Okay.
If you look up tea caddy, you'll see lots of different shapes.
And do they need to be always covered in a metallic metal, like gold or silver or something?
No, just the gold on the inside. I've seen some with just lacquer lids. But when you get to the high-end ones, like my friend Wasa made, he always had a craftsman who made the ivory lid and then put the gold leaf on it.
Only on the inside?
Hmm?
Gold leaf only goes in the
On the bottom of the lid.
Oh, it
So-
doesn't go in the lining of the...
No, just the bottom of the lid. Yeah, the glaze on the pot was the inside liner.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and they're not very big. And the kind of tea he liked, the ceremony grade tea, is really expensive. And it's the first cutting, and they grind it, and it's not fermented. So it has a lot of antioxidants in that tea. So it's not just the water, but the ground leaf is in there that you drink. And I think tea started partially for medicinal reasons. So, any other questions? I guess we're done.